The clock struck midnight, and silence fell across the field. The air was colder than it should have been for spring, carrying with it the faint smell of damp soil and something else, something sour like decay that refused to rot away completely. Matthew pulled his jacket tighter and pressed his shovel into the earth. He only planted after midnight. Neighbors whispered about him, about the strange lights that flickered from his old farmhouse at odd hours, and how his crops seemed to grow faster than anyone else's. But Matthew didn't care. He had learned the rules a long time ago. Never plant before the stroke of midnight, never speak while sowing, and never look directly at the roots once they began to move. The earth groaned under his shovel as though alive. He reached into the sack slung over his shoulder and dropped in the strange wrinkled seeds he had bought years ago at a traveling market from a man with cloudy eyes. The merchant had told him in a voice like wind rustling dead leaves, "They will grow, but only if you listen." First, Matthew thought it was a scam. But the first night he planted, he awoke to find an entire row of corn fully grown, towering above him, heavy with husks that whispered when the wind passed. He had been hooked ever since. Tonight, though, the air felt heavier. His lantern flickered though there was no wind, and the soil pulsed faintly beneath his hands like a heartbeat. He pushed another seed into the ground, covered it quickly, and moved down the row. And then he heard it. At first, it was faint, almost like the whistle of the breeze through tall grass. But no, it wasn't the wind. It was words. Murmuring, rising from the soil he had just covered. Matthew froze, his hand halfway to the sack. The ground beneath him seemed to shift, and the planted row rippled slightly as though the earth itself had spoken. "Matthew!" The whisper was unmistakable. Low, gravelly, human. He stumbled back, his lantern swinging wildly and casting tall shadows across the rows. Sweat slid down his back despite the cold. This had never happened before. The plants never spoke. Not like this. A sudden gust extinguished the lantern, drowning the field in darkness. Only the moon lit the scene, casting everything in silver. And then the voices rose again, more insistent this time, dozens of whispers overlapping, crawling out from the freshly planted soil. "You've fed us, now we'll feed you." Matthew's breath caught in his throat. He realized, too late, that the seeds had not been meant to grow food. Matthew staggered backward, his boots crunching against the frosted soil. The whispers grew louder, rising from beneath the earth like steam, hissing and curling around his ears. He clamped his hands against his head, but it didn't matter. The voices weren't carried by sound. They were inside him. "You called us. You buried us. You belong to us now." His chest tightened. He turned to run back toward the farmhouse, the familiar wooden shape silhouetted against the pale moon. But the field wasn't still anymore. The soil shivered, rows of freshly planted seeds bulging upward as though something alive writhed beneath the dirt. Matthew stumbled as a thin, root-like tendril broke the surface and curled toward his boot. He kicked it away, heart slamming against his ribs, but another tendril rose, then another and another, writhing like pale fingers stretching out of the soil. The ground was alive. He bolted, racing down the rows. His breath came in clouds, his lantern long dead, the night air filled with whispers that grew into an eerie chant. He dared a glance over his shoulder. Roots and vines tore free from the earth, unfurling like skeletal arms reaching toward him. When he reached the edge of the field, he collapsed against the wooden fence, gasping. His hands trembled as he tried to steady himself. The voices had stopped. Only the sound of his ragged breathing filled the night air. For a moment, he thought maybe he'd imagined it, that the cold and exhaustion had finally broken his mind. But then, "Don't leave us here." The words drifted to him, clear and sharp. Matthew's blood went cold. Slowly, his gaze shifted back toward the field. Every row he had planted was trembling now, as if dozens of unseen bodies were writhing just beneath the surface. And then, one by one, small, pale sprouts broke through the soil. Not green like normal plants. These were gray, translucent, with tips shaped almost like tiny fingernails. And they weren't swaying with the breeze. They were moving on their own. Matthew stumbled back from the fence, his eyes wide, heart pounding in terror. The words came again, this time from every row at once, dozens of voices overlapping, too many to count. You buried us. You woke us. Now you must listen. Matthew turned and fled, sprinting across the yard, his boots pounding against the wooden porch. He threw open the farmhouse door and slammed it shut behind him, his back pressed hard against the wood. But the silence inside was worse, because when he turned toward the kitchen, he saw something impossible. On the wooden table, in a clay pot he had left empty, a single sprout had already grown. Its pale, veined leaves unfurled toward him, and it whispered his name. They had been meant to grow something else entirely. The whisper was so clear, so human, that Matthew nearly dropped to his knees. The sprout in the clay pot leaned toward him as though reaching, its tiny translucent stem curling unnaturally. Its leaves were slick, veined with faint red lines, and when it spoke, its voice seemed to come from the roots themselves. Matthew, why did you leave us underground? His stomach lurched. The empty pot, he was certain of it. He had left it barren just days ago. How had something grown inside in a matter of hours? He grabbed the pot, hurling it across the kitchen. It shattered against the wooden floor, soil scattering in every direction. But even as shards of clay bounced across the room, the sprout twitched in the dirt, still alive, still moving. Its faint whisper filled the silence. You can't destroy what you've sown. Matthew staggered back, bile rising in his throat. His eyes darted to the window, and his breath caught in his chest. The field outside glowed faintly in the moonlight, not with lanterns, not with fire, but with the pale shimmer of thousands of sprouts pushing through the soil, all writhing, all stretching upward. And their voices carried across the night like 1,000 hushed prayers. Matthew, Matthew, listen to us. He stumbled to the cabinet, fumbling for the old shotgun his father had left him. His trembling hands loaded it with shells as he muttered to himself, "It's a dream, just a nightmare." But when he turned back toward the field, the sprouts had grown taller, no longer mere stems. They had formed crude, human-like shapes, thin torsos bending under their own weight, heads drooping forward, leaves curling like skeletal hands. And then he saw faces. Not clear, not fully human, but impressions pressed into their pale flesh, like masks of agony frozen in mid-scream. His stomach twisted with dread, because the faces looked familiar. He fired a shot through the window. Glass shattered. The blast ripped through several of the figures in the field, tearing them apart. For a heartbeat, silence fell. Then, from the broken stalks, thick roots writhed upward, twitching and snapping back into the soil. And the whispers rose again, angrier this time. Why do you fight us? We only want to be heard. The plants closest to the farmhouse moved faster now, their roots slithering over the ground, clawing toward the porch. Matthew backed away from the window, clutching the gun, sweat dripping into his eyes. And then he froze. From the corner of the room, another whisper rose, soft and chilling, coming not from outside but inside the house. We've always been here, Matthew, since the first seed. Matthew's grip tightened on the shotgun, his breath uneven, eyes darting toward the corner of the room where the voice had come from. The shadows there seemed thicker than the rest of the kitchen, pulsing faintly, as if something hid within them. Show yourself, he barked, though his voice cracked, betraying his fear. The whisper answered, low and calm. You already know us. We've grown from your bloodline, from your soil. We are part of you. The words sank into him like poison. He stumbled backward, his mind flashing with memories of his father, how the old man had always tended the fields at night, never in daylight, how he had guarded his seed sack with a kind of reverence, warning Matthew never to touch it until he was older. Had his father known? The floor beneath him groaned, and Matthew felt the boards shift. Hairline cracks spread across the wood, and from them thin roots began to emerge, curling like veins across the floorboards. They slithered toward his boots, fast and deliberate. With a panicked yell, he fired at the floor. The boards splintered, soil bursting upward in a dark spray. For a moment, the roots recoiled, retreating into the cracks. But the whisper only laughed. A chorus of voices now. Dozens, hundreds, layered on top of one another, resonating deep in his chest. You cannot kill us. We are what you've fed. We are what you've planted. The shotgun slipped from his trembling hands, clattering against the floor. His pulse thundered as he staggered into the hallway, desperate to escape. There on the wall hung the family portrait. His parents, long dead, stared back at him in faded sepia tones. But tonight their painted eyes weren't still. They blinked. Matthew's stomach turned to stone. The mouths in the portrait stretched open in a grotesque mockery of a smile. And in perfect unison, the faces of his family whispered, "You were chosen to continue the harvest." He backed away, his shoulder colliding with a doorframe. Every corner of the farmhouse seemed alive now. The beams of the ceiling groaned as roots pushed through them. The wallpaper peeled as veins spread across it like mold, and even the air was thick with the smell of wet earth and rot. And then, beneath the din of whispers, he heard one voice clearer than all the rest. His father's voice. "The seeds were never food, son. They were offerings." Matthew felt his legs weaken. His father hadn't been feeding the soil. He had been feeding something else. And now that something was ready to be fed again, Matthew staggered backward, his mind reeling. His father's voice echoed in his skull like a curse. They were offerings. The truth hit him like a blow. The miraculous crops, the whispered rules, the midnight planting, none of it had been about sustenance. His family had been tending a pact, feeding an ancient hunger buried beneath their soil. The floorboards beneath his feet heaved again, the roots tearing wider gaps as the whispers grew deafening. The walls shook, rattling the glass in the windows. Then the house went silent. In that crushing quiet, Matthew realized the whispers hadn't stopped at all. They'd moved. They were inside him. His chest constricted as though roots wrapped around his lungs. He gasped, clawing at his throat, but no air came. A stabbing pain shot through his stomach, and he fell to his knees, choking. He could feel it, something squirming under his skin, weaving itself into his veins. The field outside erupted in pale light, the sprouts towering now, shaped like ghastly figures, their faces clearer than ever. Matthew could see them through the broken window. Neighbors who had vanished years ago, faces twisted in agony but mouths still moving, still whispering. They weren't crops. They were bodies. The harvest was people. With every ragged breath, Matthew realized he was becoming the next offering. His bloodline had fed the soil for generations, and now it was his turn to be swallowed. Desperate, he crawled toward the shattered shotgun on the kitchen floor. His trembling fingers closed around the barrel. He pressed it to his temple, whispering through tears, "Not me. Not like this." But before he could pull the trigger, the roots burst from the cracks, wrapping around his arms and dragging him down. The gun clattered away. The last thing Matthew saw before darkness swallowed him was the portrait of his father. The painted figure leaned forward, lips curling into a smile that hadn't been there before. "Good boy," the voice purred. And then the soil opened beneath him. He was pulled under, screaming, as the roots dragged him into the earth, his voice joining the countless others in the chorus of whispers. By dawn, the field was silent again. Only rows of pale, thriving plants swayed gently in the morning breeze, their leaves slick with dew, their whispers hidden until midnight returned. And if you passed by Matthew's farmhouse now, you'd hear it too, the faint murmur of voices drifting across the field, calling out, begging, and promising that once the seeds were planted, the soil would never let you go.